The principal secretly goes to inspect the classrooms. He is shocked to see a black student being unfairly scolded by a teacher right in his own school. Riverside Academy High School has always been known as a progressive educational environment where every student has the opportunity to develop fairly, regardless of race, background, or circumstances. Principal Daniel Carter had spent nearly 10 years building this reputation, and he took pride in creating a school where students could learn in respect and equality. However, recently, something wasn't right. Anonymous letters started to appear on his desk. At first, it was just a few, but then the number gradually increased. The letters were unsigned, with shaky, worried, and frustrated words. "Dear Mr. Carter, some teachers are not treating students as fairly as you think. We see some students being treated unfairly just because of their skin color, but we're too afraid to speak up. Not all students here receive equal respect." These accusations had no concrete evidence, no names of the senders, but they unsettled Carter. At first, he thought these might just be misunderstandings from students. But when parents began sending letters as well, it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Some black parents reflected that their children felt isolated, not supported as much as other students. A few teachers had biased attitudes, making comments that made students feel belittled. When Carter raised the issue in a meeting with the teachers, their reactions were completely mixed. Some teachers were surprised and worried, wondering if any colleagues were actually displaying discriminatory attitudes without realizing it. Others immediately denied it, saying that it was just students being overly sensitive, that they had taught fairly and professionally. As for the administrative staff, they just shook their heads, saying they had never heard of this issue before. Carter did not accuse anyone, but his instincts as a leader told him that something was being hidden. Something was wrong. If this was just a misunderstanding, why were so many students and parents raising the same issue? If all the teachers were fair, why were their students feeling treated differently? He knew that the truth couldn't just be on paper, nor could it be found in the teachers' reports. The only way to uncover the truth was for him to witness it with his own eyes. The troubling thoughts never left Daniel Carter's mind, especially as he stepped into the school this morning. The anonymous letters, the feedback from parents and students, and the avoidance from some teachers in the recent meeting still lingered in his mind, like a puzzle piece that couldn't fit into place. He knew that in order to uncover the truth, he couldn't just sit in his office and read reports from soulless numbers. He needed to witness firsthand what was really going on in the classrooms, where every rule and ethical standard of teaching should be followed with the utmost seriousness. This morning, without any prior warning, Carter stepped out of his office and walked down the school hallway. The sound of pens scribbling on paper, voices reading aloud from classrooms, mixed with the soft laughter of students exchanging notes. On the surface, everything seemed orderly, neat, just as he had always wanted to build the image of the school. But that was not enough to put his mind at ease. Passing by the literature classroom, he saw Mr. Simmons teaching energetically, students appearing focused. The history class next door was also proceeding normally, with Miss Hartley engaging in a Q&A with the students, her voice friendly but still authoritative. But when he reached the math classroom area, he suddenly stopped. A voice rang out, one that didn't resemble any teacher he had ever heard. "If you'd think harder instead of being lazy, you wouldn't be asking such stupid questions." The tone was cold, laced with sarcasm, not instructive but more like a harsh, biting mockery. Carter furrowed his brows. He stopped right in front of the Math 10B classroom, where Ms. Henderson was standing in front of the board, arms crossed, her expression full of irritation as she looked down at a student with his head bowed. "There's always an excuse," she continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Students like you never truly try." There was no doubt now. The contempt was clear in every word she said. Carter stood still for a moment, observing through the classroom window, The class was deathly silent. No one dared to speak up. Some students looked uncomfortable. A few were hunched over their desks, as though fearing that if they looked directly at the situation, they too would become the next target of their teacher's wrath. But what angered him most was the sight of the student standing at the front of the class. Marcus Robinson, a 14-year-old black boy, a relatively smart student but always a bit shy. He was clenching his hands, his fingers trembling on the desk, his thin shoulders shaking as if he was trying to hide his weakness. Carter could clearly see the shame and hurt on Marcus's face, as though he were being exposed in front of the whole class, judged mercilessly for a question any student might have asked. Ms. Henderson didn't stop there. She took a step forward, bent down closer, and spoke in a steady voice, low enough not to carry too far, but still loud enough for the entire class to hear. "This is why you'll never get good grades, Marcus. You're not the type of student who can keep up with the others, right?" The silence in the classroom suddenly became more terrifying than ever. Carter felt a rush of heat flood through his body. He never thought he'd witness something like this in the very school he ran. This wasn't the strictness of a teacher. It was public humiliation, an invisible knife cutting deep into the self-esteem of a child. No one spoke up to defend Marcus. No one dared to stand against it. The students in the class exchanged worried glances, but none dared to speak. Carter knew that if he didn't act now, this silence would become a shameful complicity. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and opened the door to enter the classroom. No one in the class noticed his presence until the sound of the door opening echoed in the quiet room. The whole class turned to look. Henderson froze, her expression quickly shifting from confidence to surprise, then to wariness. Marcus still had his head down, but when he heard the door open, he slightly raised it, his tearful eyes reflecting the image of the principal stepping into the room. Carter stood right at the door, his gaze calm but sharp, scanning the room before it stopped on the teacher standing before him. Henderson tried to keep her composure, but there was something in Carter's eyes that made her uneasy. He looked directly at her, his voice low but powerful. "Miss Henderson, what's going on here?" The atmosphere in the classroom was heavy, like a dark cloud gathering before a storm. Marcus Robinson sat still in his seat, his shoulders stiff, each breath as if choked by the shame that surrounded him. He kept his head down, eyes fixed on the meaningless numbers in his notebook, his hand gripping the pen, as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored in this moment. Miss Henderson stood right in front of the class, arms crossed over her chest, the practiced posture of someone who was all too familiar with absolute power. She didn't need to shout or slam her hands on the desk. Her cold, mocking tone alone was enough to make the students feel crushed under the invisible weight of her contempt. "I'm not surprised your grades are this bad." Henderson tilted her head, her words cutting into Marcus's self-esteem like a knife. "Let me guess, you'll blame the teacher, right?" Marcus clenched his lips tighter but said nothing. He knew that any resistance would only make things worse. Miss Henderson wasn't the type of teacher who tolerated defiance. Anyone who had ever fallen under her gaze knew that. Beside him, a few students exchanged uneasy glances. Some lowered their heads, pretending to focus on their work. Others simply turned away, pretending they didn't see or hear anything. But everyone could feel the injustice happening right before their eyes. No one dared to speak up. No one dared to defend Marcus. Henderson didn't stop. She took a step forward, leaning toward Marcus's desk, making him feel as though he was being surrounded. "I wonder," she began, a slight smirk forming on her lips. "Do you think you're special?" She paused, a thin empty smile passing over her face before disappearing. Because I've been teaching here long enough to know one truth. Students like you." She paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air, each syllable falling slowly, like a curse trapping Marcus in helplessness. "Always tend to fall behind the class." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Marcus held his breath. His heart tightened. The room became quieter than ever before. The other students may not have spoken, but they all understood what she was implying. This wasn't just a reprimand about homework or attitude. This was a judgment steeped in prejudice. This was an accusation not based on ability or effort, but solely on the color of his skin. Marcus felt his ears burn, his throat dry, but he couldn't say a word. He knew that if he spoke now, his voice might crack, tremble, break, and that was exactly what Henderson wanted, because that would be proof that he couldn't stand up to her. She had done this before, to other students, and she would continue to do so unless someone stopped her. Carter stood silently by the classroom door, his hands clenched into fists. A quiet, simmering rage spread through his body. This wasn't an outburst of anger, but a deep, cold fury, the fury of someone witnessing injustice and unable to turn a blind eye. This was not how a teacher should treat their students, and he wasn't going to let this continue for another second. Without hesitation, Carter pushed the door open. The door creaked loudly, breaking the oppressive silence in the room. Every student turned their heads. Marcus looked up, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, as if he couldn't believe someone had actually come to intervene in this situation. Henderson flinched. For a brief moment, Carter saw a flicker of confusion cross her face, but it quickly disappeared. She took a deep breath, regaining her usual arrogant composure, and turned to face him. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady but betraying the tension in her eyes. "You're here in my class without prior notice?" Carter didn't respond immediately. He scanned the room, looking at each student's face before his eyes settled on Marcus. The boy was still trembling slightly, but had managed to clench his hands under the desk, trying to steady himself. Then he turned to Henderson. His gaze was sharp, his voice calm but authoritative. "Miss Henderson," Carter said slowly, each word ringing clear, leaving no room for evasion. "What's going on here?" Henderson blinked, her arms still crossed in front of her chest, as if trying to hide the fleeting tension on her face. The moment Carter walked in, the atmosphere in the classroom froze. All sounds seemingly sucked out of the room, leaving only a suffocating silence. The students' gazes shifted toward him, some with looks of surprise, others filled with hope, as if this were the first time someone had entered to break the injustice they had become so accustomed to. And then there was Marcus. The boy still sat there, like a forgotten shadow in the corner of the class, but his eyes were filled with hurt and despair. Henderson quickly regained her composure, a faint smile forming on her lips. It wasn't a friendly smile, but rather one of fake confidence, as if she was trying to reassure herself more than anyone else. "Oh, hello, Mr. Carter. I was just teaching Marcus a lesson about responsibility." Carter didn't waver. He wasn't easily deceived by smooth words or a false appearance. Henderson might be able to deceive the students, scaring them into silence in the face of injustice. But she couldn't do that with him. He walked over to Marcus, who was still sitting with his head bowed, his shoulders stiff, like a young bird trapped among a pack of wild animals. "Are you okay, Marcus?" Marcus nodded slightly, but Carter could clearly see that he wasn't okay at all. No child could be okay when being humiliated by a teacher in front of their classmates, treated as if they were inferior and worthless. The boy's eyes were wet with tears, but he bit his lip tightly, trying to keep his voice from trembling. Carter felt a sharp pain in his chest, not just for Marcus, but for all the children who had to endure such injustice in silence. He turned to face Henderson. His gaze was as sharp as a blade, and his voice, though not loud, was strong enough to capture everyone's attention. "Miss Henderson," Carter said slowly, "what's going on here?" A moment of eerie silence filled the room. Henderson blinked again, but this time the confidence in her eyes faltered. Still, she wasn't one to back down easily. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice still maintaining a semblance of calm, "I'm just trying to help Marcus understand that in life, he can't always rely on others to save him from the consequences of his lack of effort. I believe, as an educator, you would agree with me that students need to be responsible for themselves, right?" She emphasized the word responsibility, as though testing whether Carter would fall into the trap of her reasoning. But he just looked at her, his expression unchanged. "And you think teaching responsibility by humiliating a student in front of the class is an effective educational method?" Henderson pressed her lips together, her eyes now showing signs of irritation. "I'm not humiliating him. I'm just teaching him a lesson. If I'm not strict, he'll never learn anything." Carter lifted his chin slightly, his tone still calm but sharper now. "Then can you explain to me what lesson you're teaching Marcus? How to endure humiliation? Or how to accept being treated unfairly without being able to speak up?" The classroom was completely silent. Some students looked up, staring at Henderson, waiting to see how she would react. Henderson clenched her teeth, clearly displeased that the students were watching this situation rather than being afraid anymore. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice now more annoyed, "I don't think you should interfere with my teaching methods like this. I have over 10 years of experience in the classroom, and I know what's best to help my students progress. Perhaps you think I'm a little strict, but I assure you, I'm just doing my job." Carter calmly stepped forward, his eyes locking with hers without blinking. "Then, I'm afraid you've been doing your job wrong, Miss Henderson." Every breath in the classroom seemed to stop for a moment. Henderson froze. In all her years of teaching, no one had ever told her that right in front of her students. Carter didn't back down. A teacher is not someone who stands above students to judge them. A teacher has no right to make students feel inferior or worthless. And, most importantly, a teacher should never bring personal biases into the classroom. His gaze didn't falter, and his voice carried the strength of someone who would not compromise with injustice. "I've been here long enough to see exactly what's going on, and I will not allow it to continue." The whole class held their breath. Marcus looked up, and for the first time, a spark of hope flickered in his eyes. But Henderson stood motionless, as if all her plans, all her control, had just been erased. She opened her mouth but closed it again, for there was no excuse strong enough to change the truth. Carter didn't wait for her response. He turned to the class, his voice deep but full of authority. "I will meet with Miss Henderson in the office right now." The classroom was completely silent, but everyone understood that this was no longer just about Marcus. It was the change the school had been waiting for a long time. The atmosphere in the classroom became thick, almost as if it had frozen the moment Carter's words echoed. His question wasn't loud or harsh, but it was sharp enough to cut through any of the excuses Henderson was desperately clinging to. "And that means humiliating her in front of the entire class." The question rang out in the still air, making the room feel as though it had stopped breathing. Some students subtly lowered their heads, avoiding Carter's gaze as though they feared that, by looking at this scene, they would be caught up in an unequal battle between the principal and the teacher. But Henderson wasn't easily pushed into a corner. She had been teaching here for over 10 years, long enough to know that in this education system, teachers still held power. Students could complain, but few dared to oppose. And if anyone did, she always knew how to make them seem wrong. A dry smile appeared on her face, a smile that was not friendly, but a sign of resistance. "You're misunderstanding, Mr. Carter," she shrugged, trying to maintain her calm, though her eyes showed a hint of wavering. "I'm just doing what's best for my student. Sometimes discipline is necessary. If we don't set standards, students will think they can do whatever they want without any effort." Carter didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his gaze not filled with anger but carrying the weight of a verdict. "Discipline doesn't mean humiliating your students, Henderson." The air in the classroom suddenly became heavier. A few students looked up at the principal, as if they were hearing something they had long wanted someone to say. Carter took a step forward, his voice still calm, but each word seemed to strike directly at a place Henderson couldn't deny. "Discipline doesn't mean spreading fear instead of respect. And discipline certainly doesn't mean using your power to impose your prejudice on a student just because they don't fit in with the rest of the class." This time, Henderson couldn't keep up her confident attitude. She clenched her jaw, her hands crossed in front of her chest like a defensive wall. She didn't want to admit what Carter had just said because she knew that if she did, it would mean accepting that she was wrong. "Mr. Carter," Henderson said, her voice beginning to grow sharp, as though she was trying to defend her stance to the very end. "I don't think you should interfere with my teaching methods like this. I have over 10 years of classroom experience, and I know what's best to help my students progress. Maybe you think I'm a bit strict, but I assure you, I'm just doing my job." Carter smiled lightly, but his smile didn't carry any satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who knew the truth and was waiting for the other person to face their mistake. "Well then, I'm afraid you've been doing your job wrong, Henderson." The class held its breath. Marcus, who had been silent up until now, slowly looked up, his eyes full of surprise. Henderson was stunned. In all her years, no one had ever said something like that to her, especially not in front of students. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but Carter didn't give her that chance. "Teachers aren't there to look down on students and judge them. Teachers don't have the right to make students feel inferior or worthless. And more importantly, teachers should never bring personal biases into the classroom." Each word was emphasized, like a sentence condemning everything she had done. Carter knew he wasn't just speaking to Henderson, but to all the kids in this class. Kids who had been silently enduring. "I've been standing here long enough to see clearly what's going on, and I won't let it continue." Henderson pressed her lips together, her hands clenched. She could no longer hide her discomfort. Carter turned to Marcus, his voice softening, though still serious. "You haven't done anything wrong, Marcus. Keep going with your lesson. We'll make sure no one stops you from learning the way you deserve." Marcus looked up, for the first time that class not keeping his head down. Henderson clenched her jaw, her eyes flashing with resistance, but she knew she had no other choice. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her calm, but anyone could hear the tension in her voice. Carter turned away, calm but with no intention of relenting. "We'll talk about this privately, right now." Henderson spun around, quickly walking to the door, but Carter noticed her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't say a word to Marcus, not a single apology, no sign of remorse. And that only made Carter more certain that he was right. When the door closed behind them, the atmosphere in the classroom was still heavy, but for the first time it no longer felt filled with fear. Carter didn't look back, but he could feel many eyes on him. Not just Marcus's, but all the students who had silently endured this. And he wouldn't let them stay silent any longer. The office door still wavered slightly after closing behind Henderson, but the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The tension of the confrontation was gone. No longer the sharp, defiant voice of a teacher caught in a lie. All that remained was a silence filled with unanswered questions, suppressed emotions, and a boy waiting to be heard. Carter took a deep breath, feeling the weariness seep into his muscles, but he had no time to stop. He pressed the intercom button, requesting his assistant bring Marcus Robinson into the office. Just a few minutes later, a gentle knock echoed, timid and hesitant. "Come in, Marcus." The door opened, and Marcus stepped inside, his eyes glistening with anxiety. He still wore the slightly oversized uniform, the collar slightly crumpled as if he'd been clutching it during the lesson to comfort himself. He didn't know why he had been called in. Though Henderson had left, the years of pressure under teachers like her had conditioned Marcus to associate being called to the office with punishment. Carter could see it in the way the boy stood a little tense, his gaze darting nervously across his desk as if searching for a disciplinary slip or some judgment. He smiled gently. "Sit down, Marcus." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then cautiously made his way to the chair across from Carter. He sat, but his posture was still stiff, his hands clasped together in his lap. Carter watched him for a while, giving him time to adjust to the silence, to understand that there was no one here to scold him. Then, in a calm but sincere tone, he spoke. "You didn't do anything wrong, Marcus." The boy froze. No one has the right to treat you like that. Marcus blinked quickly, and for a moment Carter could see him trying to hold back his emotions. But then, the walls of defense he had built over the years to shield himself from insults and prejudiced glances began to crack. His lips trembled slightly, and Carter saw his eyes start to shimmer with tears. For the first time this morning, the boy had someone on his side. For the first time, an adult had told him that he was not wrong. Marcus swallowed hard, turning his face away slightly as if he didn't want Carter to see his eyes. But Carter didn't rush to make him respond. He gave Marcus time to accept something he had never dared to believe. Finally, a small voice spoke, full of hesitation, full of the hurt he had been hiding for so long. Do you really think that, sir?" Carter nodded without hesitation. "I don't just think it, Marcus. I know it." The boy still didn't look him in the eye, but his shoulders trembled slightly. But I've always been told I'm not good enough, that I'll never keep up with the others. I ... His voice caught in his throat. "I try, sir. I really do try." Carter felt a pang in his heart. A child shouldn't have to feel like they need to justify their existence. "I know, Marcus," he said gently. "I know you've tried, and I also know that you haven't gotten the support you deserve." Marcus took a deep breath, as if trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. So what now, sir?" This time, the boy looked directly at Carter, his eyes filled with both worry and hope. And Carter knew that his answer would change something in this boy forever. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Now, I will make sure this never happens to you again." Marcus blinked, as if he didn't fully understand the meaning of those words. "You won't have to walk into class feeling scared every day anymore. No one will tell you that you're not good enough, that you can't, that you don't deserve it. And I want you to understand that you never have to lower your head when you haven't done anything wrong." The tears Marcus had tried so hard to hold back finally fell, but this time they weren't tears of shame or helplessness. They were tears of release. Carter let him sit there, not pushing him to say anything more. He simply sat quietly, letting Marcus know that he would be here, that not all adults turned their back on him. Finally, when the boy took a deep breath and looked up, Carter saw a change in his eyes. It might not be immediate confidence, it might not be strength right now. But it was a spark, and that was all a child needed to start over. Marcus left the office with a different look, a different posture, as if what Carter had just said had begun laying the groundwork for a change inside the boy. But Carter knew that one conversation with the student wasn't enough. The boy might feel heard today, but if the system remained the same, kids like Marcus would continue to be pushed to the margins. Carter couldn't let that continue. He turned on the computer screen, drafted an urgent email, and sent it to the entire school board and department heads. Urgent meeting, 2 p.m. today. All board members must attend. As soon as he hit the send button, Carter leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. He had been here long enough to know that issues like this couldn't be solved by a single decision. The board, the fateful meeting. At 2 p.m., the school's meeting room was packed, all the board members present. Vice Principal Allen, a man nearing retirement, held a conservative view of the education system. He always believed that strictness was necessary, that teachers shouldn't be overly monitored because it damaged their authority. Monica Reynolds, head of the math department, was somewhat hesitant when standing between power and righteousness. She had heard complaints from students but had never really stood up to object. Elaine Foster, head of the student counseling department, was always concerned about student welfare, but she knew the school's rules were too rigid to truly protect the kids effectively. First, mandatory training on equality in education. All teachers will be required to undergo training on equality in education. We can't pretend that everyone fully understands their own unconscious bias. If anyone refuses to participate, they will not have a place in this school. Establishing a student protection committee. I will establish a special committee consisting of teachers, counseling staff, and student representatives. Students will have a place to report when they feel they've been treated unfairly without fear of retaliation. 3. Revamping the teacher evaluation process. We will no longer evaluate teachers solely based on student test scores. Each teacher will undergo anonymous surveys from students and parents. Any discriminatory behavior will be documented and dealt with seriously. He looked around the room, waiting for a reaction. Allen seemed displeased but couldn't object. Monica Reynolds bit her lip, seemingly contemplating what she had just heard. Mrs. Foster nodded slowly, agreeing with Carter's decisions. After a moment of silence, Allen sighed, his tone resigned. If that's what you want to do, I won't oppose it. Carter didn't respond immediately. He looked at each person one by one, making sure they understood what was about to happen. I'm not doing this just because I want to. I'm doing this because I have no other choice. From today on, this school will change. No more discrimination, no more silence. No one will ever feel like they don't belong here. The silence was finally broken when Mrs. Foster gently tapped the table. A small action, but one with great significance. A new chapter for Riverside Academy had just begun. Carter walked out of the meeting room, feeling the shift in the atmosphere around him. The meeting was over, decisions had been made, but he knew the real battle had just begun. He wasn't under any illusions that things would change immediately. There would be opposition, there would be those who quietly resisted, and there would certainly be teachers unhappy with their increased oversight, but he no longer cared about that. As he walked down the school hallway, Carter noticed many groups of teachers gathering together, exchanging meaningful glances and whispering quietly. He could guess what they were talking about. And sure enough, the very next morning, their reactions began to surface. Not everyone was ready to accept change. Some teachers, especially those with long tenure at the school, began to express their discontent indirectly. They didn't speak out openly, but their opposition showed in the way they looked at Carter as he walked down the hallway. They avoided mentioning the new decisions in their departmental meetings, as if they didn't exist at all. Some quietly complained to one another that teachers were now being too closely monitored, that they no longer had the freedom to teach in their own way. Vice Principal Allen, who had reluctantly agreed in the meeting, could not hide his discomfort. He avoided Carter even more, only showing up to meetings when absolutely necessary. And each time he found ways to dodge topics related to the changes in the teacher evaluation system. Carter wasn't surprised. He knew people like Allen and the passive-aggressive teachers didn't really care about the students. They only cared about maintaining their power and control. But what Carter couldn't accept was the fact that some teachers were deliberately showing their discontent right in front of the students. 3 days after the meeting, Carter started receiving reports about suspicious behavior from certain teachers. One English teacher, Mr. Mitchell, stood in front of his class and subtly declared, "It seems like now we have to be careful with every word we say, or we'll be accused of favoritism." Another math teacher, Ms. Sanderson, sighed as she handed out tests. "I hope you don't think that your grades are a result of me discriminating. I'm just grading as fairly as I know how." A gym teacher, Mr. Reeves, told his students, "No one will always lift you up. If you think just complaining will change things, you'll soon realize life's not that simple." These weren't outright confrontational words, but they were enough to plant seeds of doubt in the students' minds. Carter knew they were trying to create an atmosphere of skepticism, attempting to undermine the credibility of the changes he was making, and that was unacceptable. But alongside the opposition from some teachers, something else was happening, something much more important. Students were beginning to feel that someone was truly on their side. Students like Marcus, who had been treated unfairly but never spoke up, were now beginning to find the courage to tell their stories. Students of color, who often felt sidelined, now seemed to have found a glimmer of hope. Even students who weren't directly affected recognized that something was changing, that their school was becoming a fairer place. A group of students began approaching Carter during recess, expressing their support. An 11th grade student, Samantha, told him, "Mr. Carter, we really appreciate what you're doing. So many of my friends have endured discrimination in class, but no one has ever stood up for them before." A 10th grade student, Darren, shared, "I never thought anyone in the administration would care about this. Before, whenever we complained, they just told us not to be so sensitive." But what touched Carter the most was when Marcus came to his office after school, the first time with a genuine smile on his face. The boy no longer lowered his head when speaking to him. He stood up straight, his eyes brighter, and spoke more clearly than ever before. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Now I know I'm not alone." Carter knew that just because students had started to feel they had a voice, it didn't mean the battle was over. He knew there would still be many teachers resisting quietly, more complaints from those who didn't want change, and challenges he hadn't foreseen. But when he saw students like Marcus beginning to believe they deserved respect, when he saw other students starting to speak up, he knew he was on the right path. And no matter how long this battle lasted, he wouldn't back down. Because if a principal couldn't stand up for their students, who would? The atmosphere at Riverside Academy was no longer the same. The change did not happen immediately, nor was it loud, but it quietly seeped into every classroom, hallway, and conversation between students and teachers. It began with furtive, suspicious glances, then turned into small discussions, and eventually led to noticeable changes in how students and teachers interacted with each other. Marcus Robinson was the clearest evidence of this change. At first, Marcus remained cautious. He was too familiar with being underestimated, too used to feeling like the weakest student in the class, so much so that even when he knew he had the principal's protection, he still didn't dare believe things would truly be different. But soon he began noticing the small things he hadn't seen before. Ms. Henderson no longer stood at the front of the class with her sharp eyes scanning the room, seemingly looking for a student to criticize. There were no more sarcastic comments echoing throughout the classroom. No more heavy feeling when Marcus raised his hand to ask a question. There were no more pitying glances from his classmates because now everyone knew that Marcus was not the weak one. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe without anyone watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. During math class, when Mr. James, the temporary teacher filling in for Henderson, called Marcus to the board to solve a problem, he hesitated for a moment. But instead of the mocking remarks he was used to, Mr. James simply said, "Just do your best, Marcus. If you make a mistake, I'll help you fix it." Just one simple sentence, but enough for Marcus to realize that he truly had a chance to improve, not just be a living target for criticism. He walked to the board, chalk in hand, and for the first time felt that he could actually belong there. It wasn't just Marcus who changed. Other students gradually became bolder when they saw the transformation happening at the school. Before, when a student was treated unfairly, silence was the only response anyone knew. Not because they didn't want to help, but because they knew that if they spoke out, they would be the next target. But now, that was no longer the case. During an English class, Mr. Mitchell, one of the teachers who had openly opposed Carter's changes, deliberately ignored a black student when they raised their hand to speak. The classroom fell silent for a moment. Then something happened that had never occurred before. Another student, Ethan Parker, a white boy who had always remained neutral in everything, raised his hand and said, "Mr. Mitchell, I think they've had their hand up for a while." The entire class turned to look at Ethan. Mr. Mitchell froze for a second. It wasn't what he had expected. He didn't think any student would dare be so blunt. He could have ignored it, could have found a way to deny it, but the pressure in the room was too obvious. Finally, he reluctantly nodded. "Okay, go ahead. You may speak." The black student smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of joy, but one of surprise and relief. Someone had finally spoken up. And that changed everything. The change wasn't only coming from the students. Some teachers still clung to their old ways of thinking, but they couldn't ignore the pressure rising in the school. Ms. Sanderson, who had once mocked the idea of teachers being monitored, no longer dared to express her dissatisfaction so openly. Mr. Reeves, the PE teacher, had also reduced his negative comments toward students. No one wanted to be investigated. No one wanted to be forced to attend meetings to explain themselves to Carter. But Carter knew there were still those who silently resisted. They didn't dare do it publicly, but they were waiting for an opportunity to regain control, and Carter wouldn't let that happen. As he watched the changes in the students, he knew he had taken the first step. But the fight was not over. He knew that teachers like Ms. Henderson weren't the only ones in the system. He knew that if he didn't continue to act, these changes would only be temporary. So, he began planning his next steps. Conducting monthly anonymous student surveys. Students would be able to report discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. Expanding teacher training programs. Not just a one-time mandatory course, but a continuous training system aimed at long-term mindset changes. Imposing clear consequences for teachers who violate the rules. Not just symbolic warnings, but real consequences. After school that day, Carter received a handwritten letter on his desk. The handwriting was neat, but slightly trembling. Dear Mr. Carter, I don't know if you actually read these letters, but I just wanted to say that I feel like things are changing. Before, I didn't think anyone cared about us, but now I'm starting to believe that we have a chance to actually be heard. Thank you, a student. There was no signature, no name, but Carter didn't need to know who wrote it. He just needed to know that justice was slowly finding its place in the school. And he wouldn't stop. Carter sat in his office, holding an anonymous letter from a student. The simple words contained a significant truth. Change had begun to take root. But he knew that for it to truly endure, it had to be reinforced with even stronger actions. The next step was clear. Make the final decision regarding Henderson, and overhaul the entire educational system of the school. After Henderson was suspended, Carter ordered a thorough investigation into her previous actions. Initially, he focused on reviewing student and parent complaints, but the deeper he dug, the more he realized that this was not an isolated case. It was a pattern of repeated behavior over the years. The findings shocked him and made him angrier than ever. There were students who had been humiliated by her to the point of requesting to switch classes, and some even dropped out. There were parents who had written letters of complaint, but were dismissed with the excuse of just a misunderstanding. There were young teachers who had witnessed her behavior, but were afraid to speak out for fear of retaliation or being labeled unprofessional. All of this had created a toxic system where teachers could abuse their power without consequence, while students were silenced. There was no doubt about it. Henderson could not be allowed to return. Carter convened a meeting with the district's Board of Education. After presenting all the evidence, he firmly recommended that Henderson be permanently banned from the education field. This time, no one could oppose him. 3 days later, the official decision was made. Henderson's contract was permanently terminated. When she received the news, she came to meet Carter one last time. The office door swung open, and Henderson walked in with a face no longer full of arrogance but with pure fury. "Mr. Carter, I can't believe you would do this to me." Her voice was full of bitterness. "I've dedicated over 10 years to this school, and you just throw me away because of a few complaining students." Carter remained unfazed. He stood up, calmly facing her. "It's not because of a few students, Henderson. It's because of too many students. You had the chance to change. You had the chance to make things right, but you didn't care." Henderson clenched her fists, her face red with anger. "Do you think you've won, Mr. Carter? Do you think changing a few rules can erase everything? This system has always worked the way it does. No one will stay here long enough to see it truly change, Carter." Carter looked directly at her, his voice steady but firm. "You're right about one thing, Henderson. This system has been operating wrongly for far too long, and that's why I'm here to fix it. And you will no longer be part of it." Henderson glared at him for a few seconds before turning her head arrogantly and walking out of the office for the last time. The door slammed shut behind her, and with it, a dark chapter in the school's history officially closed. But firing Henderson was just the first step. Carter knew that if he wasn't careful, another Henderson would step into the void, and everything would go back to square one. So he decided to do something unprecedented in Riverside Academy's history: reevaluate the entire teaching staff. Some teachers were not happy. They felt that rehiring was a sign of distrust toward those who had worked there for years. They feared that the new teachers would completely change the way the school taught. But Carter didn't care about their objections. He wanted teachers who truly valued students, not those who only cared about their own power. So he set new criteria for hiring. Teachers must demonstrate an understanding of equality in education. They must be willing to participate in continuous training programs. They must show empathy and support for students, rather than using strict discipline to impose control. More than 30% of the old teaching staff was replaced in the following school year. The new teachers came from various backgrounds, but they all shared one thing in common. They wanted to create a fair learning environment for all students. One of the new teachers, Rachel Meyer, had previously worked at a prestigious school before transferring to Riverside. At the new teacher meeting, she said to Carter, "I used to teach in a place where students of color had no voice, where those who were treated unfairly had no way to fight back. I couldn't change it there, but I'm so happy to have the opportunity to do that here." Carter nodded, knowing he had found true allies. With the new teaching staff, Carter continued to implement deeper reforms. Student counseling system. Each student would have a teacher advisor to track. Their development, helping them not feel isolated. Student involvement in teacher evaluations. Teachers would be evaluated not only by their superiors, but also by their own students. Continuous training. Teachers must attend mandatory annual training on equality and fairness in education. One morning, Carter walked down the school corridor where there were no more mocking laughs from teachers, no more fearful glances from students. He saw Marcus sitting with a group of friends, laughing and chatting naturally as if nothing had ever happened. The boy no longer kept his head down. Another group of students was debating a lesson excitedly, with no one hesitating to ask questions. And at the far end of the hallway, a new teacher was patiently guiding a student, without frustration, without imposing discipline. Carter smiled gently. The fight had never been easy, but today, for the first time in years, he knew he had brought the school back to its true mission. The hallway of Riverside Academy was bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. But it wasn't just physical light. There was a shift spreading through this space, a sense of new beginnings, of a fresh future. The hallways, once weighed down with fear, were now alive with lively conversations, the bright laughter of students, and teachers who genuinely cared about their students. Carter walked slowly down the hallway, taking in the changes that he and the students had created together. The new teachers, hired not just for their expertise but for their compassion and spirit of innovation, were listening to students, encouraging creativity, and building an atmosphere of true educational equity. Students no longer avoided the gaze of their teachers as they walked through the hallways. They no longer lowered their heads, no longer afraid when called to the board. Discussions were livelier than ever. Classes were no longer a place where teachers imposed their thoughts, but a place where students had the freedom to express their opinions without fear of ridicule or dismissal. Riverside had once been a place where students like Marcus Robinson felt voiceless, where students of color silently accepted discrimination. But now, everything had changed. Carter was walking past the sophomore classrooms when he heard a voice call from behind. "Mr. Carter." He turned, and Marcus Robinson was running toward him. But this was no longer the Marcus of the past. The boy who once trembled before the teacher's ridicule, who lowered his head in fear of judgment. Today, Marcus walked with confidence, his eyes shining as brightly as the sunlight outside, and a radiant smile on his face. Carter stopped and waited. Marcus stopped in front of Carter, breathing a little heavily, but there was no hesitation in his eyes. "Mr. Carter." The boy took a deep breath. as if ensuring that what he was about to say wouldn't be swallowed back down his throat as it had been before. "I just want to say thank you." Carter felt his heart tighten a little. It was just a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of everything that boy had been through. The years of discrimination, the humiliations in front of his peers, the moments when he felt he could never rise, simply because others had decided he couldn't. Today, Marcus was no longer the scared boy he once was. Carter gently paused, looking at the boy with eyes full of understanding. "It's nothing, Marcus," he said, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Everyone deserves respect." Marcus nodded, his smile still there, but this time, in his eyes, there was something Carter had never seen before: hope. The boy waved goodbye and ran toward his classroom, where he no longer had to fear anything. The classroom door closed behind Marcus. But Carter knew that another door had truly opened. As Carter continued down the hallway, he could feel the difference even among the staff. The familiar faces of the old teachers were still there, but no one dared openly oppose the changes anymore. And more importantly, the new teachers were gradually creating a new culture for Riverside Academy. Ms. Rachel Meyer, the new English teacher, passed by him. She had previously taught at a prestigious school, but moved to Riverside to help students who had been left behind by the old educational system. Mr. Daniel Clark, a young math teacher, was patiently re-explaining a problem to a group of students, without any scolding or frustrated frown. Ms. Elaine Foster, the head of student counseling, had begun hosting open discussions where students could share their experiences without fear of judgment. The school was no longer a place of imposed authority, but had become an environment where equality was the core value. Carter knew that the battle was never truly over. There would still be teachers who silently resisted. There would still be those unwilling to change. There would still be students affected by the social prejudices outside. But he also knew that the first stone had been thrown into the still waters. The ripples were spreading, and most importantly, the students had begun to believe that they had value. Carter stood in front of his office window, looking out at the schoolyard. There, he saw a group of black and white students sitting together, laughing as if the distance between them had never existed. He saw a teacher attentively helping a struggling student, with no signs of annoyance or mockery. He saw a school that had finally become a place where every child had a fair opportunity to grow. He knew he would continue to fight. But today, at least for today, he could take a deep breath and feel that he had done the right thing. The classroom door closed, but the door to justice had just opened. The story of Principal Carter and Marcus Robinson is not just about a change in a classroom or a school. It's the story of fairness, of standing up to injustice, of how one person can make a difference just by listening and acting. But Carter had changed that. And the most important thing he did wasn't suspending Henderson. It was creating an environment where students like Marcus could hold their heads high, where teachers were chosen for their dedication, where fairness was not just a slogan, but a real commitment. What about you? Have you ever witnessed injustice at your school or workplace? What would you do if you saw someone being treated unfairly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this video to spread the positive message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Henderson might only be one individual, but she represents a system that has existed for far too long. A system where students had no voice, where those in power were allowed to manipulate and impose prejudices without consequence. But Carter had changed that, and the most important thing he did wasn't suspending Henderson. It was creating an environment where students like Marcus could hold their heads high, where teachers were chosen for their dedication, where fairness was not just a slogan, but a real commitment. What about you? Have you ever witnessed injustice at your school or workplace? What would you do if you saw someone being treated unfairly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this video to spread the positive message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.